You're 13 years old, draped in silk the color of Persian sunsets, wearing gold that weighs more than the truth anyone will tell you about what happens next. The servants braid pearls into your hair with hands that won't meet your eyes. Your mother applies kohl around your lids with fingers that tremble, and when she finally speaks, her voice carries the hollow tone of someone delivering a death sentence. "Tonight," she whispers, "your father will summon you." The room tilts. You've seen your older sisters return from his chambers with something extinguished behind their eyes, moving through the palace like beautiful ghosts. You understood, in the way children understand thunder, before they learn the word for storm. That childhood ends not gradually in this place, but in a single night. What you don't yet know, what your mind can't hold until it happens, is that the man who gave you life considers that gift a contract, and tonight he's come to collect, too. Before we go deeper, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm constantly amazed that a story this dark, buried for millennia in palace ruins, can reach people across every continent today. This is Persepolis, 481 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire stretches from Egypt to India, the largest dominion the world has ever seen. Its ruler, Xerxes the Great, commands millions, controls the wealth of nations, builds monuments that scrape the sky. Greek historians will write about him with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Persian records, carved in stone, proclaim him the King of Kings, chosen by Ahura Mazda himself. Divine authority made flesh. But there's another archive, whispered rather than written, passed through the women's quarters in voices too quiet for scribes to hear. It's the record of what happens when a man holds power so absolute that even the word daughter becomes just another category of possession. What Xerxes did to the girls who called him father wasn't hidden in shadow or conducted in shame. It was woven into the fabric of imperial power itself, justified by religion, enabled by custom, and accepted by a court that had learned the fatal lesson that nothing, not even blood, places anyone beyond the reach of a king who believes himself a god. The girl's name was Amestris, not the famous queen, but one of the lesser-known daughters, one whose story survives only in fragments and inference. On the night of her 13th birthday, a eunuch arrived at the women's quarters, his face professionally blank, his high voice carrying instructions like inventory notes. The king required her presence. She would come alone. She would speak only if addressed. These weren't threats. They were simply the terms of existence in a palace where the king's desire carried the force of cosmic law. The walk through the palace corridors must have felt eternal. Past guards who stared straight ahead. Past courtiers who found sudden interest in the floor's mosaic patterns. Past rooms where her brothers studied warfare and governance, preparing for futures that held possibility and choice. She wore cosmetics that made her look older, perfumes that made her smell like the concubines she'd seen in procession, silk that whispered against stone floors like a funeral march. Here's what the historical record tells us, pieced together from Greek accounts, Persian inscriptions, and the archaeological remains of palace life. Xerxes maintained a harem of extraordinary size, even by imperial standards. Herodotus, writing a generation later from interviews with Persian sources and Greek witnesses, mentions not just the scale but the composition. Wives, concubines, captives from conquered peoples, and daughters of nobles sent as tribute. But he also records something that Greek audiences found almost incomprehensible. The king's own daughters, once they reached what Persians considered maturity, entered this same system. They were summoned. They were used. They were, in the language of power, available. This wasn't the desperate secret of a single depraved ruler. It was embedded in Persian royal ideology itself. The theological framework supporting it ran like this: the king's blood was divine, descended from Ahura Mazda through ancient lineages that separated royalty from common humanity. To maintain this sacred essence at its purest, the closest blood must unite with the closest blood. Sibling marriages were common among Persian royalty, but some kings, Xerxes prominent among them, extended this logic in a more disturbing direction. If royal blood was sacred, and if concentrating that blood produced the purest heirs, then fathers and daughters could unite as part of that sacred duty. The religious justification was sophisticated enough to silence most critics. The practical reality was simpler and more brutal. Absolute power makes its own permissions. When you rule an empire where subjects prostrate themselves in your presence, where your word can end or create life without question, where even your closest advisors hold their positions at your pleasure, the concept of my daughter and my property blur into indistinguishability. What happened in Xerxes's private chambers that night, and on the nights that followed for Amestris and her sisters, left no written record. Persian royal archives didn't document such intimacies, but we know the before and after. We know that girls entered those chambers as children and emerged as something else. Never quite concubines because their royal blood elevated them, never quite daughters because their father had redefined that relationship entirely. We know from Greek accounts that Xerxes's treatment of his daughters became notorious enough to reach Athens and Sparta, used by Greek orators as evidence of Persian decadence, proof that empires built on absolute monarchy inevitably descended into moral chaos. We know from the archaeological record something perhaps even more chilling. This practice was normalized enough to be discussed in court correspondence without euphemism or shame. Marriage contracts mention princesses who had known the king before being given to nobles. Religious texts debate the proper rituals for bloodlines that mixed paternal and filial connections. The palace's physical layout included dedicated quarters for royal daughters distinct from the general harem, suggesting systematic organization of how the king accessed his children. One daughter's story breaks through the historical silence with particular clarity. Artente, a name that appears in multiple Greek sources, usually attached to scandal. By the time she was 15, she had already been summoned repeatedly by her father. She had learned to perform the dissociation that palace women taught each other, the mental techniques for separating mind from body, for existing in two places simultaneously, present enough to avoid angering the king, absent enough to survive psychologically. But Artente made a mistake that revealed just how total the king's control was. She formed an attachment to someone outside her father's permission structure. Some sources say it was her uncle, Mesistes, Xerxes's brother. Others suggest it was Mesistes's son, her cousin. The identity matters less than what happened when Xerxes discovered it. He didn't punish Artente directly, not at first. He punished Mesistes's wife instead, his own sister-in-law. The Greek accounts are explicit about what followed. She was mutilated in ways designed to destroy beauty and function both. Her breasts, her nose, her ears, her lips, cut away as punishment for her husband's transgression and as a message about what happened when anyone interfered with the king's exclusive access to his daughters. Artente herself vanished from the record after this incident. Whether she was executed, imprisoned, or simply married off to a remote province where she could be forgotten, the sources don't specify. But her disappearance speaks its own language. In a system where the king's power was absolute, where even family bonds meant nothing against royal prerogative, the appropriate penalty for asserting even the smallest autonomy was erasure. The deeper horror lies not in the exceptional cruelty of individual moments, but in the systematic normalization of the practice. Xerxes didn't conduct these relationships in secret, racked with guilt or aware of transgression. He conducted them as a natural expression of power, surrounded by a court that had convinced itself, or been convinced, that kings operated under different moral laws than ordinary humans. Consider what this meant for the other daughters. The ones watching their older sisters disappear into their father's chambers and return changed. They grew up knowing their fate. Palace servants prepared them explicitly. Mothers gave instruction on how to please the king, on techniques for managing pain and fear, on the cosmetics and postures that he preferred. Eunuchs, who controlled access to the king, evaluated each daughter as she approached puberty, assessing when she would be ready for royal attention. The psychological architecture of this system was sophisticated and devastating. By making the abuse systematic and expected, by surrounding it with religious justification and courtly ritual, by ensuring that every woman in the palace was implicated either as victim or as enabler, the system prevented solidarity and resistance. Mothers couldn't protect daughters without risking their own positions. Daughters couldn't flee without abandoning siblings who would face the king alone. The web of complicity and shared trauma became its own prison, more effective than any physical walls. When Xerxes launched his massive invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, he brought portions of his harem with him, including several daughters. The official explanation was that the king required familiar comforts even on campaign. The practical reality was more calculated. Daughters could be used as rewards for generals who distinguished themselves, creating bonds of loyalty through marriage to royal blood. Several such marriages are documented in the Greek accounts. Young princesses, some as young as 14, given to generals decades older as payment for military success. These weren't arranged marriages in the traditional sense, where families negotiated alliances. These were transactions where the king distributed his daughters like bonuses, creating a market where royal women's bodies became currency for purchasing loyalty. The daughters had no voice in these arrangements. They were informed they had been given to a particular man, expected to express gratitude for being used in ways that served the empire's interests. The Greek campaign failed. Xerxes' forces won initial victories, but were ultimately defeated at Salamis and Plataea, forcing the king to retreat back to Persia with his grand ambitions shattered. This military humiliation had profound effects on his treatment of his family. Historical sources suggest that after the Greek defeat, Xerxes became more withdrawn, more paranoid about loyalty, and more focused on exercising the forms of power he could still control absolutely. The power over the palace, the harem, the women who couldn't refuse him. His summons to his daughters became more frequent after the retreat from Greece. New daughters reaching puberty were claimed younger. The king, who had failed to dominate the Greeks, doubled down on dominating the humans within his reach, as if total control over his family could compensate for his inability to control his enemies. This is when another daughter enters the record. Another Amestris, though perhaps the same one from the opening scene, now older. She was maybe 15 when Xerxes decided to use her in a scheme of particular cruelty. There was a noble named Artabanus who commanded the royal bodyguard, positioned dangerously close to power. Xerxes wanted to bind him more tightly to the throne, so he offered Artabanus his daughter in marriage, a tremendous honor that couldn't be refused. But before arranging the marriage, Xerxes summoned Amestris repeatedly to his chambers over several months. By the time the marriage was formalized, she was pregnant with the king's child. Artabanus found himself married to a teenage bride carrying her father's baby, forced to raise as his own son a child who was simultaneously his wife's brother and the king's grandson. The political calculation was brilliant in its cruelty. Artabanus was now bound to Xerxes through multiple overlapping ties, each one a thread of complicity and shame. He couldn't move against the king without destroying his own wife. He couldn't reveal the truth about the child's parentage without admitting his own humiliation. He was trapped in a web of forced loyalty, and at the center of that web was a 15-year-old girl whose entire existence had been orchestrated to serve her father's political interests. For 21 years after the Greek failure, Xerxes ruled from Persepolis, building elaborate additions to the palace complex, hosting festivals of impossible luxury, managing the empire through subordinates while he focused increasingly on pleasures within his control. His sons, born of different mothers and competing for succession, watched their father's treatment of their sisters and understood the lesson being taught. Power recognizes no boundaries. Authority supersedes every other bond. The strong do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was assassinated in his own bedchamber. The conspiracy involved multiple members of the court, possibly including Artabanus, the same man who had been forced to marry the pregnant 15-year-old years earlier. The official accounts are contradictory and confused, but the message is clear. Even absolute power eventually generates enough resentment to produce its own destruction. What followed was a bloodbath. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, fought his brothers for the throne, ultimately prevailing through superior ruthlessness and political skill. And in the process of consolidating power, he systematically eliminated threats, including threats represented by his own sisters, his father's daughters, now women in their 20s and 30s. Some were executed. Some were forced into marriages with Artaxerxes' supporters, redistributed as political tools just as their father had distributed them. Some were sent into internal exile in remote provinces. Some simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown but almost certainly grim. The women who had already been victimized by their father discovered that their suffering didn't end with his death. They became pawns in their brother's struggle for power, used again, discarded again, their entire lives shaped by being born into a family where women existed purely as instruments. One of these daughters, perhaps the Amestris from the opening, perhaps another, ended up married to a Persian noble named Megabyzus. She bore children, managed a household, fulfilled all the expectations of an aristocratic wife. But according to fragmentary sources, she also tried to maintain connections with other royal women who had survived the purges, creating networks of mutual support among women who shared the experience of systematic abuse. These networks were dangerous. They represented women acting with agency, making choices, potentially organizing in ways that served their own interests rather than simply accepting male authority. The court's eunuchs, who controlled information flow in the palace, monitored these relationships carefully, reporting to Artaxerxes about which women were forming alliances. Eventually, the king decided this particular daughter had become too independent. Her children were taken from her and raised in the palace where she couldn't influence them. Her correspondence was monitored. Her movements were restricted. She was systematically isolated from everyone who might have offered solidarity or support. She died at 33. The official cause was illness. The real cause was the accumulated weight of decades of abuse, exploitation, and systematic destruction of every human connection she tried to create. Her death was barely noted in court records. Her children, raised away from her, were taught to remember their grandfather Xerxes as a great king, builder of monuments, leader of armies. The fact that he had used their mother as an instrument, that he had broken her long before she finally died, wasn't part of the story they were taught. This was the pattern for most of Xerxes's daughters who survived him. Childhood spent knowing they would be used, years of actual use, marriages arranged as political transactions, continued exploitation by brothers or husbands, isolation if they showed any signs of independence, and deaths that came either from violence or from the slower destruction of accumulated trauma. Some ancient voices questioned these practices, even within Persian society. Zoroastrian priests debated whether the king's treatment of his daughters aligned with religious principles, emphasizing truth and righteousness. Some nobles privately worried that if the king could use his own daughters this way, no woman was truly safe. These concerns were always expressed carefully, in private, never in writing. But they existed, creating an undercurrent of unease even among elites who generally benefited from the system. Greek historians recorded the practices with fascination and horror, using them as evidence of everything wrong with monarchy and Persian culture. Herodotus included multiple stories about Xerxes's daughters as cautionary tales about what happens when power faces no constraints. Later writers elaborated, sometimes exaggerating for effect, but preserving information about real practices that Persian sources often omitted or euphemized. The Achaemenid dynasty continued for more than a century after Xerxes's death, but the patterns he had intensified persisted. Royal daughters continued to be used instrumentally, treated as property, given as rewards. The practice created long-term instability by destroying trust within royal families, making every succession a violent crisis because no one could be certain of support even from siblings or children. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia in 334 BCE, one factor in Persian defeat was the internal weakness of a court riddled with paranoia and betrayal, where generations of practices like those Xerxes had established had made genuine loyalty nearly impossible. The empire was wealthy and powerful, but it was hollow at its core, held together by force rather than by any bonds of shared humanity or mutual obligation. After Alexander's conquest, Greek observers who examined Persian records and interviewed survivors documented what they found. Marriages between fathers and daughters, princesses distributed as rewards, royal women treated as political instruments rather than as people. These records were studied by later historians trying to understand how great civilizations fell, and one recurring conclusion was that societies permitting absolute power without moral constraints eventually consumed themselves from within.